to see peace, want to see peace, want to see prosperity, and want to see stability. And the peace we talk about is not just the absence of conflict, but those friendly relations between tribes, between ethnicities and nationalities, where there is trade and engagement and cultural exchange in a friendly relational sense, which builds the prosperity, the economic prosperity that improves lives right across the globe. And of course, then you see the result of the stability that comes from that. So peace, prosperity, and stability, and that's something that we desire as an objective in our region, but of course globally as well. And it's worth continuing the effort to do that. And governments and what governments do actually matter in working towards those objectives. There are obviously differences in the way that we can reach those objectives, but I think there is a kind of a first principle that we all want to see peace, prosperity, and stability globally and regionally. And so what we do as a government actually contributes to that and makes a difference to that. And of course, you've touched on, the previous speakers, how we do that, and I've sort of summarized it in the 3 Ds: diplomacy, defense, and development assistance, or aid, as it's sometimes called, but also obviously our work as a sovereign state within the international architecture that exists, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's groups like ASEAN or the Quad or whatever. You can debate about whether you think this architecture works or these groups work or whether they're effective or not. But the important point is the more that you have not just bilateral relations between countries, but multilateral architecture, the more likely you are to build the scaffolding for that peace building as well, or the institutional, the structural requirements to better reach those objectives of peace, prosperity, and stability. So we all play a part in that. And I think the Australian government, as a middle power, although I had lunch with Gareth Evans, our former foreign minister, a while back, and he sort of coined that term, one of the first to coin that term. Some people don't like the middle power moniker, but I agree with Gareth on that. We are a middle power. And the reason I kind of emphasize that is that it is in our national interest to ensure that we have that peace, stability, and that prosperity in our region. And we do so by working with other nations within the international rule of law, within that architecture, that multilateral architecture, within what's called a liberal rules-based order. And I say liberal in the sense of it being inclusive of human rights, international law, the law of the sea, and other normative frameworks that not only benefit us and move us towards that peace and that prosperity in the region, but also benefit many other nations across the region, across the globe. And working within that framework, whether it's through our security framework, whether it's through trade and having laws that we abide by, actually sets the structures for peaceful relations. That's why it's so important to build those institutional structures as part of that peace building effort. Because as a middle power, we are not large enough or powerful enough to use the blunt instrument of force to reach our objectives, or the blunt instrument of military force to reach our objectives. There are obviously some countries that do that. They use force to reach their strategic objectives. Obviously, Putin and Russia is a perfect example of an invasion of a smaller neighboring country. So we don't want to see that. And I think the principles around the rule of international law are so critical to us as a middle power. So that brings us to how we go about making that contribution to the peace building, but also that architecture, if you like. And I mentioned the 3 Ds. And this is where I think the balance is really important, because each of the 3 Ds are important, and getting the balance right is critical. So yes, you need to have a defensive capability to deter others from using force. And that defensive capability should be, work together with partners as a collective deterrence. But nor should you have it way too much above the diplomacy, the development. And I think previous speakers pointed out that we have cut, criminally, we've cut our development budget over, particularly over the coalition government period, by some 11 billion. Diplomacy has been, hollowed out, or the resources for diplomacy. And Penny Wong, our foreign minister, is doing a fine and really admirable effort to try and rebuild our diplomatic work, and she has proven that diplomacy works. And I actually think getting that balance right of the 3Ds is so critical. I will make the point, though. I mean, I noticed Professor Langmore talked about defence capability. There is a need for defence capability, and ironically, we're being criticised by the right for not spending enough on defence because some of those announcements around the defence strategic review are pushed out, over 10 years rather than the forward estimates where there's not new spending necessarily. But I think the important principle here is that you're not spending on defence capability so that you can move towards conflict. In fact, it's the inverse. Your spending on defence capability should be designed to ensure that you avoid conflict, that the deterrent effect of your defence capability is enough that it ensures that adversaries and others don't use military force as a means of reaching their strategic objectives, that they're deterred from doing that because it's too costly. And of course, we know that war is far more costly from a humanitarian perspective, but also from a financial perspective than peace. Some of you would recall that I think Australia spent as a percentage of GDP on defence at the height of World War II, some 33% of our spending of GDP was on defence because we were in the middle of World War II. Now, we want to avoid that. So the question is, where do you set your defence spending to ensure that you have the necessary deterrent effect, you have the partnerships in collective deterrence, and you have the balancing with our diplomatic and our development assistance, our diplomatic efforts and our development assistance. I think, as I think Tania was saying, going to some of the examples of the diplomatic work of the Albanese government, I'll pick one example. For example, the diplomacy effort around our engagement with China, our relationship with China. The whole of that is a really good example of that balancing of the 3Ds. We have really upped the diplomatic effort. We've upped the diplomatic effort because we're seeking to reduce tensions with China, which had been increased, obviously, under the previous Morrison government, who beat their chests and tended to use some of the international relationships that we have to whip up a bit of domestic political point scoring and fear mongering. We're not about that. We wanted to get to a point where we could reduce the tensions in the relationship, restart our engagement, particularly on our trade, removing some of the tariff barriers that were put up by China, using diplomacy to do that effectively, to bring us back to a point where we are seeing the mutual benefit of our economic relationship as something good for our nation and their nation. And we've had some success in that. And I think the Albanese government should be given some real credit for that because you've seen that diplomatic effort pay off with some of the removal of tariffs on some of our exports, for example, but also a reduction in the tensions. However, the defence capability spending is also part of that. It actually works in conjunction with the diplomatic effort. So our capability has actually a clear message that we are seeking to deter the use of force in trying to reach objectives. Getting adversaries, whether it be China or any other adversary, to go back to diplomacy, to go back to trade as a much more effective means of engagement rather than using force. Now, that doesn't always work. We've seen, obviously some of the issues around China. Just today, the Chinese jet throwing flares at near a Navy helicopter which was on a UN mission near Korea. But the work continues in that space. And I think the other element is the development assistance. That is critical as well, because it builds up the capacity and the capability of our neighbours so that they become self-sufficient and they can engage with us and trade with us for their benefit. And I often struggle, as I'm sure many of you do, in trying to explain this to people who say, well, charity begins at home. Why are we spending all this money giving aid away to these countries in the Pacific or in Myanmar, wherever else? And I think it's important to be consistently explain this to people and the general public because, unfortunately, Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister, killed, frankly, the bipartisanship that was thereabouts on our commitment to development assistance and sort of ran that argument. And we saw, as I said, 11 billion in aid cut under Julie Bishop, the then Foreign Minister. We need to continually make the argument that our development assistance, it's not just a charity. It's about building up capacity with our Pacific partners, for example, so that we can engage and they can build up their standard of living, their prosperity, their economic independence, that they can trade, they can they can actually be more self-sufficient, and that it's not just beneficial for them, it's beneficial for us because it creates, if you like, the peace building elements of stability in the region and that economic prosperity, and it allows us to have partners where we can have those friendly relations with, which I was referring to earlier. And again, I think credit to the government in the work that has been done in rebuilding our relations with Pacific partners, and them seeing Australia once again as a partner of choice, and engaging with Australia in that way, because in the past there has been a fair degree of, I think, arrogance towards our Pacific partners, and a lack of respect in the way that we dealt with our those nation states, and that has been extremely improved under Penny Wong's leadership and her engagement in the region. Finally, before we go to questions, I think this point about peace building in a world of war, the 50 or 60 years post World War II were kind of unique in human history. I think we need to be clear about that. The relative stability, although there were conflicts and proxy wars that continued right throughout. I mentioned the Sudanese conflicts have been going on since the 50s, by the way, the civil wars in Sudan. But the uniqueness of this past 50, 60 years is kind of not the norm throughout human history. Throughout human history, you have tended to see the constant conflict between nations and states and tribes and ethnicities, between sectarian factions and so on. We've been blessed almost, I think, in the last 40, 50 years with a relatively peaceful period. We are trying now to hold on to that kind of structure, that rules-based order, that international and multilateral architecture, which has been the scaffolding that has allowed that relative peace for this period. And I would say, in order for us to actually succeed in holding on, we have to do more than hold on. And I've argued this publicly. We need to actually evolve that rules-based order so that there is ownership of it by our Southeast Asian partners, that it's not seen simply as a Western construct built out of, the post-World War II period, the Bretton Woods Agreement, and, the US kind of leadership. And the US obviously is no longer the primary superpower. There needs to be an engagement with our partners in the region, and I'm talking now about Indonesia and Malaysia and all the many countries in Southeast Asia and North Asia, where and globally, where there is a real evolution of that liberal rules-based order, so that those countries themselves see the benefit of having a normative framework that administers and manages relations between countries in the most peaceful way possible within the context of an international rule of law, if you like, so that they see the benefit to their own economies and to their people. And I think the majority of countries do see that in the region, certainly in my engagement, with those countries. There are those who would seek to bring that down, and that is something we have to resist, if you like. But giving ownership of the evolution of that rules-based order is actually critical, because once you have more countries feeling like they have a piece of that rules-based order, that they're invested in it, the more likely they are to also defend it and stand by it in times of stress and strain. I don't see another way forward. And Australia actually now, and in conclusion, I'd say, Ulfat, Australia actually plays a critical role in the 21st century in helping evolve this rules-based order. We played this role, by the way, in the past. We did. I mean, Doc Everett was instrumental in helping set up the UN and those structures, and much of that international architecture post-World War II, where once again Australia finds itself not, as Keating said, on the arse end of the world, but actually in the centre of geopolitical challenges. And we play, I think, a very critical role as a middle power with other middle powers, building up those structures and evolving those structures so that we can navigate through this very, very difficult period, as we call it, the world of war and conflict, and get through the rapids to a more stable or settled, stiller waters down the track. But it will be a difficult few decades. And our obligation and our responsibility in our international affairs is to help navigate not just Australia, but our neighbours and our partners through this very difficult period. and commitment to those principles, commitment to international law, commitment to democracy, and all of the things that actually help build the peace and the prosperity and the stability are really critical challenges for us. And I know that we're cognizant of that as a government. I am certainly in my role in looking at national security issues and foreign policy issues, which I've done for many decades. But it's a challenge we all need to step up to, and that includes not just government but civic society as well. And I think these kinds of engagements are also a really important part of that overall effort. So thank you for having me tonight to share some of those thoughts.
Thank you, Peter Khalil, for the comprehensive, really useful overview of the different conflicts in the world and the summary. Thanks. Okay, I will. It's almost 8:30, so I think this will go on for the next 30 hours. So I will start the questions. Question number one, and it's to any of the speakers. The weapon manufacturers are making a fortune. Our weapon industry is growing. It works in the favor to continue wars. How much do you think this contributes to war? How can we change this? So it's to all the speakers. John, you, Peter, or Tania,
I'll defer to my wiser colleague in Professor Militich or Professor Langmore, my wiser colleagues to.
One thing I'd say is that I think it was a mistake for the previous coalition government to make such a bid to build up the Australian weapon manufacturing industry and so as to export more. I mean, we don't need to use that form of using our raw materials, and I'm glad to say that Albanese is dramatically in encouraging other processing of our materials and the establishment of other industries. There's no need for us to be active in that area at all. Also, we should be discouraging the growth of the weapons trade. I mean, that only contributes to warfare, and most people in most countries want peace. They don't want warfare, and we've got public opinion strongly on our side in saying that.
Thanks, John. And in the last part of the same question is, how can we change this?
One thing to do would be to seek accountability for what Australia is doing. It's hard to find out where these weapons are being sold, and there's next to no publicity about it. But even for people who try hard to find it, they can't get it all. So accountability would be one significant step forward.
And I would just add to that. But yeah, that globally, I mean, increasing understanding of the motivation in terms of the amount of global economic impact of violence, which is estimated to be worth about 14 trillion in purchasing power parity in 2023. So to answer that question, it's a strong part of our existing systems and institutions that hold up a lot of the structural inequities we have. Very few, there are a lot of people making money, but proportionate to people globally, it's at the expense of minority, and a small minority make a lot of money out of our existing systems. And so economic benefits that could be improved from reducing violence is what we call a big so much more towards more productive sectors like health, education, and so forth. And as John said, a greater understanding and accountability for the systems in which that sustain this isn't just about governments, how they're managing their resources and so forth. It's about the broader internationalized system that sustains the economic benefit to those in the militarized, industrialized complex.
Thank you. Thanks, Tania. Peter, do you have anything to contribute to that question, or?
No, we could go on because I know there's a lot of questions on.
Okay. The second question is from Colin. It's to John, to you. A new agenda for peace is one of the UN Secretary General's policy briefs prepared as an input for this year's Summit of the Future. Do you have any hope that the summit could provide some sort of circuit breaker to the escalating global trend to militarism and away from multilateralism? What role could Australia play in this process?
Well, I'd like to thank Colin for that excellent question. You're well informed, and the new agenda for peace is a splendid document, in my opinion. So the question's well framed. There will be a serious debate about it, and some parts of it will be more acceptable than others. The question we as Australians need to take seriously is, what will our country say in relation to those recommendations? And as I mentioned in what I said, one of the things so far that they haven't done is to ratify the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty. But there are many other constructive suggestions as well, and there is to be a conference sponsored by us and by the UN Association on the 6th of August, at which that's one of the issues that we'll be talking about, in the hope of trying to publicize the good ideas that are in that new agenda for peace. I recommend it to everyone who's interested in this subject. I think there are, what tends to happen at the UN is that there's incremental acceptance of good ideas. There'll be a vigorous debate about this one. Some things won't get up, but some things are likely to, depending on the extent of the organisation and how obvious the benefits would be if they were introduced. So I do have hope that there'll be progress out of it.
Thank you, John. And another question is from Nathan. Peter focused strongly on our Pacific neighbors and how we are a middle power that can help to strengthen and maintain peace in our region. However, many conflicts are well outside of our region, where we share neither a geographic or cultural relationship, and in many cases, we are only minor economic partners. What can we do to help maintain peace in these remote conflicts? Is this even something we should pursue with our limited remote influence, or should we only focus in our own region? You're mute.
Thank you, Nathan, for that very, very important question, because you've hit right on what has been a long-standing, I think, point of tension in Australian foreign policy. How broadly do we engage globally as a power, a middle power, or do we stay inside our sort of regional, focused on our region, if you like? There was the old concentric circles theory. That was a sort of a defense theory as well, where, you just, as the concentric circles away from Australia got wider and wider, you do less and less. I'm going to tell you what my view is, because this is my personal view over many decades working in foreign policy. I have a particular view about this, and that is that given the globalized world, the way that the issues that might occur on the other side of the planet will inevitably have an impact on us whether it's through our diaspora communities, whether it's through geostrategic tensions that might impact us, or trade, or the conflict in Ukraine, for example, had an impact on wheat prices. There's no way of avoiding or having a sort of a kind of simplistic geographic focus on Australia's interests. We are part of the world. We are part of the global. We're a global citizen. We're a good international citizen on the whole. And so that brings us to Nathan's question. Do we focus all of our efforts on the Pacific and Southeast Asia? Well, yes, to a certain extent. But I wouldn't say that we should be dissuaded from engaging in other parts of the world, both for humanitarian reasons, but also for strategic reasons. Like, for example, I'm a very big supporter of more development assistance to Africa. People say, oh, Africa, what's that got to do with us? Well, actually, Africa is going to be, it's the fastest growing continent in the world. It's going to be critically important in the 21st century. There's going to be an opening up of new trade and opportunities. We should be part of that. So I'm thinking a bit more broadly about Australia's interests in that respect. So when it comes to conflicts, for conflict resolution, for example, we have got certainly a very good record in engaging and contributing to some of those efforts as an international, a good international citizen, and we shouldn't be dissuaded from doing that. So, for example, on the Palestinian issue, I mean, I've been very strongly arguing that Australia should play a substantive and constructive role, not just in ending the conflict, which is what's being worked on now to find a sustainable ceasefire, but also a constructive and substantive contribution to the reconstruction of Gaza, to the transition, both political and security, to Palestinian statehood, and through that Palestinian self-determination. There's no reason why we can't make our contribution to what would be a critically important objective to world peace, because of the fact that the war in Gaza and the conflict between Israel and Palestinians has lasted for such a long time and has such an impact across the region, but also globally. So it's in our interests, for humanitarian reasons, for geostrategic reasons, to make our contribution to that. And we have good people that can actually, and expertise that can contribute to that. Now, that becomes then a resourcing question. How much can we put into this? How much do we put into that? And it goes back to what John was saying, and I think Tania, that diplomatic resources have been cut, and that's crazy. We should be increasing our resource and our effort, because all of these things and getting the balance right between the 3Ds is so important to our national interest. So to answer Nathan's question, it's a qualified yes to contributing to, if you like, peace building further afield, not to be tied by just a one-dimensional geographic limitation. But of course, we have to be pragmatic about where we are putting our effort based on the resources that we have. And so, again, this goes up and down in history. As I said earlier, Australia was very much involved in the European theatres of war in both World War I and World War II. We were across the globe. We were in North Africa. So, and even more recently, when you were touching on our alliance with the US, we sent troops to Iraq and to Afghanistan to these conflicts. What was the interest there? People argue that it was alliance management, but also the importance of peace building, if you like, in those countries, and removing the Taliban and so on. But why, if we're doing that from a military point of view, why not the diplomatic effort, which is just as important, if not more important, again, in making a contribution to that peace building effort and that broader objective I said earlier of peace, prosperity, and stability. So I'm ambitious for Australia to play a role, and by the way, not just Africa, South America as well, which is tend to be forgotten in all of this, Latin America.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is from Damien.
Excuse me, Ulfat, can I just make one additional point to Peter's excellent answer, which is that we could increase our support for the United Nations when we're not particularly generous to the United Nations. We pay our minimum fee on time, but most countries give additional funds and we don't give much. And I think we should build up so that support for the UN to contribute to it in improving its work?
And sorry, Ulfat, it's a question Nathan's given that I want to comment on as well. But
Please, yeah.
in relation to some of Peter's comments, I really strongly support that as well. Also, as you know, a child of a father who came from the former Yugoslavia with a refugee background, like so many Australians, we have close ties and connections, and things that are happening remain intimately connected to the careers we choose. I wouldn't have gone into this field if it hadn't been for that background. And I think that increasingly, if we're thinking of peace building and creative ways of engaging meaningfully, it is like, even in situations where it's resource stretched, as Peter referred to, there are other ways in which we can engage. And for example, DFAT Africa division, that has a very small budget relative to other sections, supported diaspora community peace builders from South Sudan in Australia as a way to also contribute to work that they were doing. And there are other examples like that where we can recognise the important resources that exist amongst our communities that are Australia-based and across waves of generations of people working in various fields with strong relationships, whether that be in business or community relations, and more directly involved in continuing to try to contribute positively in situations across the world. And I think it's something for Australian government, but also for recognition of our many people within communities who work tirelessly to support peace building efforts in their other places of connection.
Thank you. Thanks, Tania, for that. And the next question is from Damien. He didn't mention who he has addressed this question to, but I'll read this one, and whoever from the guest speakers, you're welcome to answer. The liberal rules-based order favor the West. How do we sustain peace in the face of the Thucydides trap? What method conflict resolution non-hurting stalemates?
The asker is obviously well informed. I would like to be able to define the Thucydides trap because I've read about it, but on the spur of the moment I can't do so very well.
Can I interrupt?
Yes, please.
It's when a great power is declining. And how do you cope with the fact of a declining power, as we have with the United States losing its predominance in the world?
Thanks, Janet.
It's Damien Kingsbury asked the question.
And it's a good question because clearly the relative power of the United States is declining, though it's still very much stronger than China in many ways, particularly in its expenditure on the military. But these are it's a big question. I mean, it's an issue that's going to be around for decades, and so it's one that has to be tackled incrementally, step by step, and each year as it evolves. Certainly, I would go back to saying that we must aim to strengthen and improve the effectiveness of the UN organizations, and reform of the Security Council, for example, is on the agenda for the conference to be held in September, the conference on the future. And Australia should be giving thought to the best ways of attempting to achieve that. People say, oh, it's impossible. It's not impossible, because most countries in the world want to enlarge the Security Council. The only question is which countries uh, would be on an enlarged council, and the way to handle that with minimum effort is to simply increase the number of elected members, not add any permanent members. Any more permanent members would make it somewhat less democratic than it is. And we get, yeah.
Can I add, Ulfat, just to add to what Janet was saying, the Thucydides trap obviously is also when a rising power is displacing a ruling power. So the rising power, in this case, obviously China, is seeking to displace a ruling power, and the inexorable kind of not inevitable, but inexorable push towards a violent clash when that, or the structural stresses that occur. So that was a Greek philosopher that wrote of this a few thousand years ago, actually, about nations or city states displacing each other, and that most of the time when that happens, when a rising power is emerging and seeks to displace the primacy of a ruling power or existing power, there is often the rule is often there is violence and violent clash. So the question that Damien's asking is, how do we avoid that trap? And this is a pertinent question because it is the question of the 21st century. How do we avoid conflict between, the rising power of China? And I would throw in India here too, because we haven't spoken about India, but India is a rising power as well and seeking to expand its sphere of influence in many respects as well. How do we avoid conflict and war as the structural stresses start to shift the tectonic plates around? And the US is obviously, there's an argument too that it is also a diminishing power. Certainly its instability domestically points to that, and some of its foreign policy decision making under various administrations. So that is the question. That is the question before us for the 21st century. It's a fundamental question. How do we avoid war? Now, I've argued that we are navigating, or we're traversing, what I would call a very narrow path. I call it the narrow path because that narrow path to peace, or navigating through that narrow path to avoid war, is very difficult, because on either side of that path there are minefields, there are potholes. It's a very difficult path that we're traversing. But we must traverse that path to peace, because there is no alternative. The alternative is actually unthinkable, which is major power conflict, and we do not want to see that, neither in our region or globally. We've seen the effects of conflict when you have a power like Russia invading Ukraine. We've seen the effects of war in Gaza. We don't want war. We certainly don't want it between the major powers. So the points of tension here, obviously, Damien, are the question around Taiwan, and whether Taiwan returns to Chinese control in a peaceful manner, or whether it's going to be taken by force by Xi. That's a decision that no one really knows if Xi makes that decision, or when he makes that decision, and what that decision would be. And there are other points of tension around, John, you were touching on the UN and the international architecture and international law. There are points of tension around the diminishment of international law by autocratic powers like China, like the rule of the law of the sea, and the fact that
The US.
Well, yes, the US under Trump certainly has not been respectful of international law, and many other administrations as well. But the blatant and flagrant breaching of international law by autocratic regimes like Putin in invading, completely breaching the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty by invading another country with force. These are very flagrant breaches of international law and a challenge to the international liberal rules-based order and international law. Whether it's the law of the sea, whether it's trade law, whether the US does it, whether China does it, my view is, as a middle power in Australia, we have to protect that rule of law because it's in our interests. And I think many other countries in the region would probably share that view. So the question is how to do that, and how to avoid the trap, the Thucydides trap that is before us. And I saw Damien saying Athens declining, Sparta rising, so war was inevitable. I wouldn't say it's inevitable, Damien. I think there is an inexorable kind of move towards conflict, but there are ways that we can avoid that. And my old boss, Kevin Rudd, wrote a book called The Avoidable War. I suggest some of you have a read of that one, because he puts in kind of guardrails as to how both China and the US can avoid conflict going forward. It's well thought through. So we've got a lot of work to do in that space. And part of our efforts in trying to bring China back to the diplomatic space and trade and so on is really in the context of trying to avoid that trap and playing our role in doing that. And I think there's a kind of a cognizance in the Biden administration similarly to try and not inflame those tensions. And I think Biden met recently with Xi. So there is a lot of work going on to avoid that trap. The traversing of that narrow path, just in conclusion, I'll say on that point, how do we avoid that trap? It's what I touched on earlier. Diplomacy, development assistance, building up the multilateral architecture and multilateralism so that so many countries are invested in a normative framework which sets the rules of the road, so to speak, on trade and security so that we can all prosper from it. That is a very strong force. If you get enough of that force, I've actually talked about, I wrote a piece called The Fulcrum of Middle Powers. A fulcrum comes from the Latin word fulcra, which is the leg of a chair. I think there needs to be a fulcrum of middle powers to prop up the international rule of law and the rules-based order. If enough of those countries are invested in it, it will provide the counterbalance, whether it's Trump's breaches of international law, whether it's Xi's, whether it's Putin's, enough of a counterbalance to those autocratic forces and authoritarian regimes who seek to pull down those principles that we can actually protect it. So I think that's a principled look or a strategy, if you like. Tactically, it's much more difficult. The execution is very difficult, but we are trying to execute that now in our diplomatic effort with China, in our diplomatic effort in the Pacific to work with nations, in our diplomatic effort with Southeast Asian partners, in our commitment to multilateral architecture, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's, as John said, the UN, we could do better with the UN. These, I think, are the pathways or the tactics that we can use to execute that strategy. And I don't want to live in a world in which might is right. I still believe in that liberal rules-based order as a construct from what of something better. Otherwise, we look at either empire or, a complete conflict all over the place, complete chaos. And that's none of those two options I think we would accept as a future for our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, Tania.
Just in addition to what John and Peter have emphasised, I mean, I do want to say, though, that we need to do a lot more to understand and dialogue and engage with China and with our partners in the region. So it's one thing to lay the geostrategic lens over what is happening, but it actually obscures a lot of opportunities for what Damien's asking in terms of conflict resolution mechanisms that exist at the subnational level. There are so many opportunities to work and listen with humility to our partners in the region about things that are playing out at a localised or provincial level that, yes, relate to differing forces and influences of China and the US, especially in the Pacific at the moment. But when we just lay a geostrategic lens, we actually reinforce barriers that exist and that we've actually created. We don't do enough to understand and dialogue around shared challenges. And this relates both to how we continue to nourish our relationship as good partners in the region. And that comes back to things like climate diplomacy, doing more in terms of our own domestic work on reconciliation that makes us more reliable and trustworthy when we have different policies that speak to one another and speak to who we want to be within the region. That's our refugee policy, that's our trade, that's our diplomacy and our development, and that these should be as coherent as possible. And mostly it's listening and dialogue. And so that is at the level of government and the multilateral level, but that's also at the level of university to university, people to people, and so on. And so when we have contradictory policies in relation to our engagement with countries, we're talking about people. So we should have that greater coherence in what we want to be ourselves to our citizens. And as we said, coming back to the interconnectedness that has, because I do think the conflict mechanisms that work and have worked over centuries, you know, are grounded in local customary practices that feed into, and we've got to support mechanisms for how that plays out nationally, regionally. And so there's lots of opportunity there if we shift some of that emphasis on the geostrategic argy-bargy, because we know that so much conflict relates to our inability to share power, to grow power, and, you know, to make room for others. So in addition to thinking about this as a contestation, I'd like to see it to move beyond that sort of zero-sum thinking to actually how do we make space for one another so that we can work with understanding and cooperation on some of these really serious and immediate challenges that we have.
Thank you, Tania. And it's 1 minute to 9. So, and we've got so many great questions, and unfortunately, we won't be able to answer these questions. So, apologies for that. And yeah, thank you, John, Tania, and Peter, for your time today, and for the insights. And thank you, participants, and for your attendance and patience and asking all these critical questions. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and was enjoyable and effective. And I want to finish this with a short quote from the Albert Camus: "Peace is the only battle worth waging." So have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience. And we hope to see you again. Our next event will be on the 13th of June. It's about local government. We've got 3 outstanding Labor local government leaders speaking, one of whom is on this call tonight. And so we'll send you an invitation for that. But on the 1st of September, we're going to have another session on peace building, this time face-to-face with the African community, or the East African community, with one of Tania's colleagues, David Newell Vincent, and that'll be in the Bunkle Street Community Centre in North Melbourne. So we're keeping on with peace building, and I was thinking while we were talking that maybe something we could explore is the role of diasporas in our engagement with the outside world, and the capacity now gives us to have, for instance, an extremely skilled multilingual diplomatic service, for instance, because we've now got capacities we didn't have 60 years ago when people only learned French and Latin at school. So thank you, everyone. You've done great service, and we just all, in our own way, pray for peace. Thank you.